I never imagined that a single moment in my family's basement would expose 22 years of lies, manipulation, and a pattern of abuse so calculated that it would eventually land my own brother in handcuffs. But when that MRI technician's face went pale and she quietly asked me to wait while she called the radiologist immediately, I knew my parents' dismissive words about walking it off were about to crumble under the weight of medical evidence that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Sullivan household in Millbrook, Ohio, operated on a simple philosophy that my father Mark had drilled into our family since Tyler and I were old enough to understand words: champions don't complain, winners push through pain, and real athletes never let temporary discomfort stop them from achieving greatness. As the head football coach at Millbrook High School, Dad had built his reputation on transforming ordinary small-town kids into state championship contenders, and his coaching philosophy extended seamlessly into our home life, where every scraped knee, every bruised ego, and every moment of weakness was met with the same unwavering response that had made him legendary in our community. My mother Linda, the principal at Riverside Elementary, reinforced Dad's approach with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent decades managing children and understanding exactly how to distinguish between genuine problems and attention-seeking behavior. She could spot a fake stomachache from across the room, identify manufactured drama with surgical accuracy, and had zero tolerance for what she called manufactured emergencies that pulled focus away from real responsibilities and legitimate achievements. Together, my parents had created a household where emotional resilience wasn't just encouraged, it was demanded, and where the ability to persevere through adversity was considered the most valuable life skill they could possibly teach their children. Tyler had thrived in this environment from the moment he could walk. 3 years younger than me, but already 6 inches taller, and 40 pounds heavier by the time he reached high school, Tyler possessed the kind of natural athletic ability that made coaches weep with gratitude and opposing teams adjust their entire game strategies around containing his explosive speed and devastating tackles. He'd been starting varsity linebacker since his freshman year, had already received preliminary recruiting interest from Ohio State and Michigan, and carried himself with the confident swagger of someone who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through superior physical conditioning and aggressive determination. I'd found my own path through academics and distance running, channeling the family's competitive drive into maintaining a perfect GPA in my physical therapy program at Millbrook State University, and consistently placing in the top 3 at regional track meets throughout high school. While Tyler dominated the football field with brutal efficiency, I'd discovered satisfaction in the precise science of human movement, the intricate mechanics of injury recovery, and the patient process of helping people rebuild their bodies after trauma or surgery. My parents had been proud of my academic achievements, but their excitement was always tempered by the understanding that my accomplishments, while impressive, would never generate the same community recognition or scholarship opportunities that Tyler's athletic dominance promised to deliver. The summer between my junior and senior year of college had been carefully planned around maximizing my preparation for graduate school applications while contributing to the family's annual tradition of hosting Tyler's teammates for training sessions in our backyard. Dad had converted our basement into a makeshift gym years earlier, complete with weight equipment, agility training tools, and enough space for the kind of intensive conditioning work that kept Millbrook High School's football program competitive against much larger schools with significantly better funding and facilities. Tyler's friends treated our house like their personal training facility, and Mom and Dad encouraged the arrangement because it allowed them to monitor the team's development while reinforcing their reputation as the kind of family that produced champions. The incident happened on a Thursday afternoon in mid-July, when the temperature outside had reached the kind of oppressive 90-degree mark that made any physical activity feel like punishment. But Tyler and 3 of his teammates had decided that their workout schedule couldn't be disrupted by something as trivial as heat exhaustion or common sense. I'd been studying for my anatomy final at the kitchen table, taking advantage of the air conditioning and the relative quiet that came with having the house to myself while Mom was at a district meeting and Dad was reviewing game film at the school. The basement had been echoing with the sounds of weights clanging, music thumping, and the kind of aggressive trash talk that teenage athletes use to motivate each other through particularly challenging sets. I'd gone downstairs around 3 o'clock to grab a protein bar from the emergency snack stash that Mom kept in the basement refrigerator, and found Tyler and his teammates in the middle of what they called strength testing, which was essentially a series of increasingly dangerous challenges designed to prove who could lift the most weight, complete the most repetitions, or demonstrate the most impressive feats of physical coordination under pressure. They'd been at it for over 2 hours, and the combination of heat, exhaustion, and teenage male competitiveness had created exactly the kind of volatile atmosphere that would normally have prompted any responsible adult to shut down the session and send everyone home before someone got seriously hurt. Tyler was in the middle of demonstrating his latest achievement, a deadlift that was probably 30 pounds heavier than anything his strength coach would have approved, when he spotted me near the refrigerator and decided that his performance needed a larger audience to properly appreciate the magnitude of his athletic superiority. He'd always been the kind of person who required constant validation for his accomplishments, and the presence of his older sister provided an irresistible opportunity to showcase his physical dominance while entertaining his teammates with a demonstration of sibling hierarchy that would reinforce his status as the undisputed alpha of our family dynamic. The gentle push that Tyler would later describe to our parents, the emergency room staff, and eventually the police investigators was delivered with the full force of his 220-pound frame, moving at approximately 15 miles per hour, into my 130-pound body, while I was bent over reaching into the bottom shelf of the refrigerator, completely unaware that I was about to become the unwilling participant in what Tyler would characterize as harmless roughhousing between siblings who'd been playing around with each other their entire lives. The impact sent me flying forward into the concrete wall with enough force to crack the drywall and create a sound that Tyler's teammates would later describe as resembling a watermelon being dropped from a second-story window onto a sidewalk. The pain was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, starting as a white-hot explosion at the base of my spine and radiating outward through my entire nervous system like electricity passing through water, making every muscle in my body contract simultaneously, while my vision went dark around the edges and my lungs forgot how to process oxygen properly. I remember trying to push myself up from the concrete floor and discovering that my left leg had stopped responding to commands from my brain, creating a terrifying disconnection between intention and action that made me wonder if I was having some kind of stroke or neurological emergency that had nothing to do with Tyler's collision. Tyler's immediate response was to laugh, a reaction that his teammates quickly, because teenage boys in groups tend to follow the emotional lead of whoever holds the most social power, and Tyler's status as the team's.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Star player made his interpretation of events the default reality for everyone present. He'd apparently assumed that my inability to stand up was part of some elaborate performance designed to make him look bad in front of his friends, and his commentary focused on my supposed tendency toward melodrama and attention-seeking behavior that he'd been observing and tolerating throughout our childhood with the patience of a saint. By the time I managed to convince Tyler and his teammates that my distress was genuine rather than theatrical, almost 20 minutes had passed, and the initial shock had given way to a deeper, more persistent agony that seemed to intensify with every attempt at movement. Tyler's friends had quietly gathered their equipment and left through the basement's external entrance, suddenly discovering urgent obligations that required their immediate attention elsewhere, while Tyler remained behind to assess the situation and determine whether my condition warranted adult intervention or could be managed through the application of ice, over-the-counter pain medication, and the kind of positive thinking that had gotten him through countless minor injuries throughout his athletic career. When Mom and Dad returned home around 6 o'clock, they found me lying on the living room couch with ice packs positioned around my lower back, and Tyler hovering nearby with the guilty expression of someone who'd broken something valuable, but wasn't entirely sure whether the damage was permanent or repairable. Tyler's explanation of events emphasized the accidental nature of our collision, his immediate concern for my welfare, and his growing frustration with my refusal to accept his repeated apologies and suggestions for simple treatment that would undoubtedly resolve whatever minor discomfort I might be experiencing as a result of our unfortunate misunderstanding. Dad's assessment of my condition was swift and definitive, informed by decades of evaluating injured athletes and distinguishing between legitimate medical emergencies and the kind of minor setbacks that could be overcome through proper conditioning and mental toughness. He observed that I was alert and responsive, that I could move my extremities when properly motivated, and that my vital signs appeared stable enough to rule out any serious internal damage that would require immediate medical intervention. His diagnosis was a bruised tailbone and strained lower back muscles, injuries that he'd seen hundreds of times in his coaching career, and that typically responded well to rest, anti-inflammatory medication, and a gradual return to normal activity levels. Mom's evaluation focused on the practical implications of my supposed injury, particularly the question of whether my condition would interfere with my summer course schedule, my part-time job at the campus recreation center, or my training regimen for the upcoming cross-country season. She'd already invested considerable time and energy in helping me plan my senior year academic schedule, and the prospect of medical complications disrupting carefully laid plans triggered her administrative instincts to identify and eliminate potential obstacles before they could derail important long-term objectives. Her conclusion was that I was probably experiencing the kind of temporary discomfort that everyone encounters when they're not careful about proper body mechanics during physical activity, and that the best approach was to treat my symptoms conservatively while maintaining normal daily routines to prevent the kind of deconditioning that would make recovery more difficult. The next 72 hours passed in a haze of steadily worsening pain, increasing frustration with my family's dismissive attitude, and growing suspicion that something significantly more serious than a bruised tailbone was affecting my ability to perform basic physical functions. The anti-inflammatory medication that Dad had confidently prescribed was providing minimal relief. My left leg continued to experience periodic episodes of numbness and tingling that seemed completely unrelated to minor muscle strain, and my attempts to follow their advice about maintaining normal activity levels were resulting in symptoms that felt progressively more alarming rather than gradually improving. Tyler's behavior during this period oscillated between genuine remorse for causing my discomfort and increasing irritation with my failure to recover according to the timeline that his athletic experience suggested should be more than adequate for resolving minor collision-related injury. He'd offered multiple apologies for his role in our basement encounter, had volunteered to help with household chores that required bending or lifting, and had even suggested that we visit the urgent care clinic if I thought professional medical evaluation might provide reassurance about my condition. However, his patience was clearly being tested by my continued complaints about pain levels that he considered disproportionate to the relatively minor physical contact that had initiated my problems. Mom and Dad's response to my persistent symptoms was influenced by their professional experience with children and teenagers who sometimes exaggerated minor problems to avoid responsibility or attract additional attention from adults who were too busy managing legitimate crises to focus on manufactured emergencies. They'd seen countless examples of young people who discovered that injury reports could be leveraged into extended periods of reduced expectations, special accommodations, and sympathetic treatment that was far more appealing than the normal demands of academic performance and athletic participation. Their skepticism about my ongoing complaints was reinforced by my history as someone who'd rarely experienced serious medical problems and had never demonstrated the kind of dramatic response to minor injury that they were currently observing. The decision to seek independent medical evaluation came on Sunday evening when I attempted to stand up from the dinner table and experienced a shooting pain down my left leg that was so intense it caused me to collapse back into my chair while involuntarily crying out loud enough to startle everyone present. The incident lasted only a few seconds, but it represented a qualitative change in my symptoms that even my parents couldn't entirely dismiss as psychological or attention-seeking behavior. Dad's suggestion that we visit the emergency room was delivered with the resigned tone of someone who suspected that medical professionals would confirm his assessment of minor injury while providing official documentation that would hopefully satisfy my apparent need for external validation of my condition. Millbrook General Hospital's emergency department on a Sunday evening was exactly the kind of controlled chaos that small-town medical facilities experience when they're serving as the primary safety net for a community that includes a major university, several industrial facilities, and a population that tends to defer non-urgent medical care until weekends when their regular physicians aren't available. The waiting room was filled with the usual mixture of genuine emergencies, minor injuries that couldn't wait until Monday, and college students who discovered that their weekend recreational activities had exceeded their physical limitations in predictable and embarrassing ways. Dr. Patricia Hernandez was a woman in her early 40s who'd completed her emergency medicine residency at Cleveland Clinic before choosing to practice in a smaller community where she could develop long-term relationships with patients while avoiding the extreme stress and emotional burnout that characterized urban trauma centers. She'd been working at Millbrook General for almost 8 years, had treated countless sports-related injuries from both the university and high school athletic programs, and possessed the kind of clinical experience that allowed her to distinguish between minor complaints and serious medical conditions within the first few minutes of patient interaction. Her initial assessment of my condition was thorough and professional, involving detailed questions about the mechanism of injury, the progression of my symptoms, and my medical history that might influence treatment decisions. She performed a comprehensive neurological examination that tested my reflexes, muscle strength, sensation, and coordination in ways that revealed subtle abnormalities that my parents had either missed or dismissed as insignificant. Her expression became increasingly serious as she documented findings that suggested nerve compression or inflammation that extended far beyond the minor muscle strain that my family had diagnosed. The decision to order imaging studies was presented as a precautionary measure, designed to rule out serious structural damage, rather than a response to specific clinical findings that indicated major pathology. Dr. Hernandez explained that back injuries in young healthy individuals were usually minor and self-limiting, but that the presence of neurological symptoms warranted further investigation to ensure that we weren't missing something more significant that could benefit from early intervention. She was careful to manage expectations by emphasizing that most imaging studies in cases like mine revealed normal findings that provided reassurance while confirming that conservative treatment was the appropriate approach. The MRI appointment was scheduled for the following Tuesday morning, primarily because the weekend imaging staff had already handled their quota of emergency studies and non-urgent cases would need to wait until regular business hours when the full technical staff was available. Dr. Hernandez prescribed stronger pain medication to help me manage my symptoms during the waiting period, provided detailed instructions about warning signs that would warrant immediate return to the emergency department, and suggested that my parents monitor my condition carefully for any changes that might indicate developing complications. Mom and Dad's reaction to Dr. Hernandez's recommendations was a mixture of vindication and frustration, since her clinical assessment had confirmed that my injury was probably minor, while simultaneously validating my complaints enough to justify expensive diagnostic testing that they considered unnecessary. They were pleased that a medical professional had essentially agreed with their initial evaluation, but irritated by the implication that their parenting approach might have been insufficiently responsive to what was apparently a legitimate medical concern, rather than attention-seeking behavior that should have been discouraged rather than indulged through expensive emergency room visits. Tyler's response to the emergency room trip was characteristically focused on the implications for his own reputation and future athletic prospects, particularly his concern that word might spread through the community about his role in causing an injury serious enough to require medical evaluation. Millbrook was the kind of small town where high school athletic achievements were considered community property, and any suggestion that the star linebacker had engaged in reckless behavior that resulted in injury to a family member could potentially affect his standing with coaches, teammates, and college recruiters who were already evaluating his character and decision-making abilities as part of their assessment process. The 2 days between my emergency room visit and the scheduled MRI passed with agonizing slowness, complicated by my growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with my body in ways that extended far beyond minor muscle strain or bruised bones. The prescribed pain medication was providing enough relief to make daily activities possible, but it was also creating an artificial buffer between my consciousness and the full extent of my physical dysfunction that made it difficult to assess whether my condition was improving, stabilizing, or continuing to deteriorate in ways that might not become apparent until the medication wore off. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of gray overcast sky that seemed to match my mood as Mom drove me to the imaging center at Ohio Sports Medicine Institute in Columbus, a facility that specialized in athletic injuries and possessed the kind of advanced equipment that could provide definitive answers about internal damage that might not be visible through standard examination techniques. The 45-minute drive passed mostly in silence, with Mom occasionally asking about my pain levels and comfort while avoiding any discussion of what we might discover or how various findings might affect my immediate plans for summer school, fall semester, and the athletic activities that had been central to my identity since middle school. The MRI procedure itself was surprisingly peaceful, requiring me to lie motionless inside a tunnel-shaped machine while powerful magnetic fields created detailed images of my spinal structures in ways that would reveal even minor abnormalities in bone cartilage, nerve tissue, and surrounding soft tissues. The rhythmic thumping of the machine was almost hypnotic, and the enforced stillness provided the first genuine relief from pain that I'd experienced since Tyler's collision had initiated this medical odyssey 4 days earlier. The technician who operated the MRI equipment was a middle-aged woman named Jennifer, who'd been performing diagnostic imaging for over 15 years and had developed the kind of professional demeanor that balanced technical competence with emotional sensitivity to patients who were anxious about potential diagnoses. She explained each step of the process clearly, positioned me carefully to ensure optimal image quality, and maintained casual conversation during the setup phase that helped distract from my nervousness about what the scanning might reveal about my condition. Jennifer's facial expression changed approximately halfway through the imaging sequence, a subtle shift from routine professionalism to focused concern that was barely perceptible, but unmistakably significant to someone who'd been watching her carefully for signs about what the images might be revealing. She completed the scanning protocol without comment, helped me off the examination table with unusual gentleness, and then quietly asked me to wait in the consultation room while she reviewed the images with the radiologist before releasing me to return home. The wait stretched into nearly an hour, far longer than the 30 minutes that Jennifer had initially suggested would be sufficient for image processing and preliminary review. Mom's anxiety became increasingly apparent as we sat in the small consultation room surrounded by anatomical posters and medical equipment that seemed to emphasize the serious nature of whatever discussion was about to occur. Her attempts at casual conversation became more forced and artificial as time passed, and her periodic glances toward the door suggested that she was beginning to suspect that our visit might not conclude with the reassuring news about minor injury that we'd both been expecting. When Dr. James Mitchell finally entered the consultation room, his expression carried the kind of grave seriousness that immediately communicated the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. As the lead orthopedic spine specialist at the Institute, Dr. Mitchell had spent decades delivering difficult diagnoses to patients and families, and his approach combined medical precision with genuine compassion for people whose lives were about to be fundamentally altered by information they weren't prepared to receive. The images he displayed on the consultation room's computer screen told a story that was both shocking and undeniable, revealing damage to my lumbar spine that extended far beyond anything that could be explained by a single collision in our basement 4 days earlier. The MRI showed a severely herniated disc at the L4-L5 level, with nerve compression that was consistent with significant trauma, but also revealed evidence of previous injuries and healing patterns that suggested a history of repeated impacts and chronic stress that contradicted everything my family had claimed about the isolated nature of Tyler's gentle push. Dr. Mitchell's explanation of the findings was delivered with the kind of careful precision that medical professionals use when they're presenting information that will fundamentally challenge their patients' understanding of their own experiences. The current herniation was indeed serious enough to require immediate treatment and potentially surgical intervention, but the imaging also revealed scar tissue, bone changes, and healing patterns that indicated multiple previous episodes of trauma that had occurred over an extended period of time and had never been properly diagnosed or treated. The implications of Dr. Mitchell's diagnosis extended far beyond the immediate medical concerns about nerve compression and potential permanent disability. The pattern of injury visible on my MRI suggested systematic physical abuse that had been occurring for years, creating cumulative damage that had finally reached a threshold where my body could no longer compensate for the ongoing trauma through natural healing mechanisms and adaptive responses. Mom's reaction to this revelation was immediate and defensive, challenging Dr. Mitchell's interpretation of the imaging findings and insisting that Tyler's collision had been completely accidental and that I'd never experienced any previous injuries that would account for the historical damage he was describing. Her voice carried the kind of fierce protectiveness that parents display when their family's reputation is threatened, but underneath her defensive posture was a growing awareness that medical evidence was providing an objective record of events that contradicted the narrative our family had maintained for years about normal sibling interactions and harmless roughhousing. Dr. Mitchell's response was professionally neutral but firm, explaining that imaging findings don't lie and that the pattern of damage he was observing was inconsistent with isolated accidents or normal childhood injuries. He was careful not to make specific accusations about intentional abuse or family dysfunction, but his medical opinion was clear that my spinal injuries represented chronic trauma that extended far beyond anything that could be attributed to a single incident, regardless of how severe that incident might have been. The drive home from Columbus passed in tense silence, as Mom and I both processed the implications of Dr. Mitchell's diagnosis and tried to understand how we would explain his findings to Dad and Tyler without acknowledging the uncomfortable questions that his medical opinion raised about our family's dynamics and the true nature of the interactions that had
shaped my childhood and adolescence. The evidence was now undeniable and documented in medical records that would become part of my permanent health history, creating an official record of trauma that could no longer be dismissed, minimized, or explained away through appeals to normal family relationships and sibling rivalry. The atmosphere in our house that evening was thick with unspoken tension as Mom and I sat at the kitchen table with printed copies of my MRI results spread between us like evidence in a criminal investigation. Dad had been reviewing the images and Dr. Mitchell's report for nearly 20 minutes, his coaching instincts warring with his parental protective impulses as he tried to reconcile the medical findings with his understanding of our family's history and Tyler's character. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant sound of Tyler's music filtering down from his bedroom, where he'd retreated immediately after learning that we'd returned from Columbus with news that required serious family discussion. Dad's first response was to question Dr. Mitchell's competence and experience, suggesting that a specialist who saw athletic injuries all day might be predisposed to finding serious pathology where none actually existed, particularly when dealing with a patient whose injury had occurred in a context that involved high school athletics and family members who understood sports medicine better than most medical professionals. His decades of experience evaluating injured players had taught him to be skeptical of diagnoses that seemed disproportionate to the mechanism of injury, and he'd seen too many cases where expensive specialists had recommended unnecessary treatments for problems that would resolve naturally with proper conditioning and mental toughness. Mom's approach was more systematic and legalistic, focusing on the specific language Dr. Mitchell had used in his report and questioning whether his conclusions about chronic trauma were based on definitive medical evidence or speculative interpretation of imaging findings that could be explained through other mechanisms. As an elementary school principal, she'd been trained to document incidents carefully and distinguish between objective facts and subjective impressions, and her analysis of the MRI report revealed several areas where Dr. Mitchell's conclusions seemed to exceed what the evidence could definitively support. Their combined skepticism created a defensive barrier against the implications of Dr. Mitchell's diagnosis. But underneath their intellectual challenges to his medical opinion was a growing awareness that explaining away the imaging findings would require them to acknowledge possibilities about Tyler's behavior and our family dynamics that they weren't prepared to confront. The pattern of injuries Dr. Mitchell had identified suggested systematic physical aggression that extended far beyond normal sibling rivalry, and accepting his conclusions would force them to reconsider years of incidents they'd dismissed as harmless roughhousing between children who were simply working out natural competitive instincts. Tyler's entrance into the kitchen was preceded by the heavy footsteps of someone who'd been listening to our conversation from the top of the stairs and had finally decided that his continued absence from the discussion was becoming more suspicious than his participation. His expression carried the careful neutrality of someone who understood that he was walking into a situation where his words would be scrutinized for evidence of guilt or innocence, and his body language suggested the kind of controlled tension that athletes display when they're preparing for a performance that will determine their future opportunities. His initial reaction to Dr. Mitchell's findings was dismissive and confident, characterizing the specialist's conclusions as the predictable result of expensive medical testing that was designed to identify problems whether they actually existed or not. Tyler's experience with sports medicine had taught him that doctors often erred on the side of caution when dealing with athletic injuries, and his assumption was that Dr. Mitchell was following standard protocols for covering potential liability rather than providing an accurate assessment of the actual damage caused by what everyone agreed had been an accidental collision. However, as Dad explained the specific details of the imaging findings and Dr. Mitchell's interpretation of the chronic trauma patterns, Tyler's confidence began to show subtle cracks that suggested his understanding of the situation was more complex than his initial dismissive response had indicated. His questions about the timing of the previous injuries revealed a detailed knowledge of my medical history that seemed inconsistent with normal sibling awareness, and his suggestions for alternative explanations demonstrated a familiarity with injury mechanisms that went beyond what a typical 19-year-old would possess unless they'd been thinking about these issues for considerably longer than the past few days. The conversation that followed was a masterclass in family denial and collaborative reality construction, as each family member contributed elements to a narrative that would explain Dr. Mitchell's findings without acknowledging the obvious conclusion that those findings suggested. Dad proposed that my participation in track and field throughout high school had subjected my spine to repeated stress that could account for the chronic changes Dr. Mitchell had observed, while Mom suggested that my childhood tendency toward clumsiness and risk-taking behavior had probably resulted in numerous minor injuries that I'd forgotten about but that had accumulated over time to create the damage pattern visible on the MRI. Tyler's contributions to this alternative narrative were particularly creative, involving detailed recollections of incidents from our childhood where I'd fallen off my bike, tumbled downstairs, or injured myself during family activities in ways that he claimed to remember with remarkable clarity, despite the fact that he'd never mentioned these memories during previous discussions about our shared experiences. His ability to construct plausible explanations for each element of Dr. Mitchell's findings suggested either an extraordinary capacity for creative storytelling or a detailed familiarity with the actual events that had caused my injuries. The family meeting concluded with a consensus that Dr. Mitchell's diagnosis was probably accurate regarding the current herniation and nerve compression, but that his interpretation of the chronic trauma patterns was likely mistaken or exaggerated due to his unfamiliarity with our family's history and the normal range of childhood injuries that active kids experience during their development. This conclusion allowed everyone to acknowledge the seriousness of my current condition while avoiding the uncomfortable implications of Dr. Mitchell's broader findings about systematic trauma and chronic abuse. Dad's immediate response was to schedule a second opinion with a different specialist, preferably someone with experience treating athletic injuries who would understand that competitive athletes often sustain minor damage that accumulates over time without indicating any pathological pattern of violence or abuse. His contact network within the Ohio high school athletic community included several physicians who specialized in sports medicine, and he was confident that a more appropriate evaluation would provide a different perspective on my imaging findings that would support our family's understanding of normal injury patterns rather than Dr. Mitchell's concerning interpretation. Mom's focus shifted to damage control and reputation management, recognizing that Dr. Mitchell's report would become part of my permanent medical record and could potentially be accessed by insurance companies, future employers, or anyone else who might draw inappropriate conclusions about our family's dynamics based on incomplete information and misinterpreted medical evidence. Her administrative experience had taught her that official documentation could take on a life of its own, and she was determined to ensure that our family's version of events was properly represented in any ongoing medical treatment or legal proceedings that might result from Dr. Mitchell's diagnosis. Tyler's primary concern was clearly focused on protecting his athletic future and college prospects from any potential fallout that might result from speculation about his role in my injuries. His recruitment process was entering a critical phase where college coaches would be evaluating not just his physical abilities but also his character and decision-making skills, and any suggestion that he'd been involved in systematic violence against a family member could effectively end his chances of receiving scholarship offers from major programs. His questions about confidentiality and disclosure requirements revealed a sophisticated understanding of how information could spread through athletic networks and affect his reputation within coaching communities. The next few days passed in a strange limbo where my family maintained their normal routines while carefully avoiding direct discussion of Dr. Mitchell's findings or their implications for our understanding of Tyler's behavior and our family's dynamics. The prescribed pain medication was helping manage my symptoms, but the psychological impact of having my experiences validated by objective medical evidence was creating an emotional processing challenge that was completely separate from the physical aspects of my recovery. For the first time in my life, I had independent confirmation that the pain and dysfunction I'd been experiencing were real and serious rather than exaggerated or attention-seeking behavior. This validation was simultaneously liberating and terrifying because it forced me to reconsider years of incidents and interactions that I'd accepted as normal sibling relationships but that might actually represent a pattern of systematic abuse that had been hidden in plain sight through family narratives about roughhousing, competition, and character building. The medical evidence was creating space for me to acknowledge experiences that I'd previously minimized or dismissed, but it was also raising questions about my own judgment and perception that were deeply unsettling. My conversation with Rebecca Chen, my roommate and closest friend from the physical therapy program, provided the first opportunity to discuss Dr. Mitchell's findings with someone who wasn't invested in protecting our family's reputation or Tyler's athletic future. Rebecca's pre-med background gave her the scientific knowledge to understand the implications of chronic trauma patterns on medical imaging, and her emotional distance from our family dynamics allowed her to ask questions that my parents and Tyler were carefully avoiding. Rebecca's reaction to my description of Dr. Mitchell's findings was immediate concern, followed by careful questions about the specific incidents and injury patterns that could account for the damage he'd observed. Her clinical training had included education about recognizing signs of domestic violence and abuse, and she understood that victims often minimize or rationalize their experiences in ways that make it difficult to identify systematic patterns of violence until objective evidence makes denial impossible. Her suggestion that I document everything I could remember about previous injuries and their circumstances was presented as a way to provide Dr. Mitchell with additional information that might help him develop a more effective treatment plan, but the process of creating this documentation would also serve as a systematic review of my experiences that might reveal patterns I'd never consciously recognized. Rebecca offered to help with this process, providing both emotional support and the kind of objective perspective that would be necessary for identifying incidents that I might have unconsciously minimized or forgotten. The documentation process was more difficult and emotionally challenging than I'd anticipated, requiring me to revisit years of experiences that I'd filed away as unimportant childhood memories but that took on different significance when viewed through the lens of Dr. Mitchell's medical findings. Each incident I recorded seemed minor in isolation, but the cumulative pattern that emerged was disturbing in ways that made me question my own perception and memory of our family's dynamics. The list included dozens of falls, collisions, and impacts that Tyler had been involved in either directly or indirectly, from playground incidents when we were children to more recent examples of aggressive physical contact that I'd accepted as normal brother-sister interactions. What became apparent through this systematic review was that Tyler's physical interactions with me had consistently involved more force than necessary and had frequently resulted in injuries that were dismissed by our parents as natural consequences of childhood activities and sibling relationships. Rebecca's analysis of my documentation was careful and professional, but her conclusions were unambiguous about the pattern of behavior that my experiences revealed. The frequency and severity of Tyler-related injuries far exceeded what would be expected from normal sibling interactions, and the family's consistent response of minimizing my complaints and attributing my injuries to clumsiness or oversensitivity suggested a systematic pattern of enabling behavior that had allowed Tyler's aggression to continue and escalate over time. Her recommendation was that I share this documentation with Dr. Mitchell and consider involving law enforcement or protective services, since the medical evidence combined with the historical pattern of incidents suggested ongoing physical abuse that posed continued risks to my safety and well-being. Rebecca's concern was not just about past injuries but about the likelihood that Tyler's behavior would continue or escalate if it wasn't addressed through appropriate intervention and consequences. The decision to contact Dr. Mitchell's office and schedule a follow-up appointment was difficult because it represented a clear choice to pursue the implications of his diagnosis rather than accepting my family's alternative explanations and moving forward with conservative treatment that would avoid confronting uncomfortable questions about Tyler's behavior. Calling his office felt like crossing a line that would fundamentally change my relationship with my family and potentially destroy the unity that had been central to my identity throughout my childhood and adolescence. Dr. Mitchell's response to my request for additional consultation was immediate and supportive, reflecting his recognition that patients dealing with trauma-related injuries often need time to process the implications of their diagnosis and develop trust in medical professionals who are willing to address difficult questions about family dynamics and personal safety. His willingness to meet with me again, review my documentation, and discuss treatment options that addressed both my physical injuries and the underlying causes of those injuries was the first step toward taking control of my medical care and personal safety. The second appointment was scheduled for the following week, providing time for me to complete my documentation process and prepare for a conversation that would likely involve difficult questions about my family's response to Dr. Mitchell's original findings and my plans for protecting myself from future incidents. The intervening days were filled with careful preparation and emotional processing as I tried to understand the full implications of acknowledging that my brother's behavior represented systematic abuse rather than normal sibling competition. Tyler's behavior during this period was noticeably different, characterized by exaggerated concern for my welfare and repeated offers to help with daily activities that had become difficult due to my ongoing symptoms. His attention felt performative rather than genuine, designed to demonstrate his caring nature to our parents and anyone else who might be observing our interactions. The change in his behavior was subtle but significant, suggesting that he understood the seriousness of the situation and was attempting to create evidence of appropriate sibling relationships that would contradict any accusations about past abuse or violence. Mom and Dad's response to my request for additional medical consultation was supportive in principle but clearly motivated by their desire to control the narrative and ensure that any further medical evaluation would support their interpretation of Tyler's behavior rather than Dr. Mitchell's concerning conclusions. Their insistence on accompanying me to the follow-up appointment was presented as parental concern for my welfare, but their obvious anxiety about what I might discuss with Dr. Mitchell suggested that they understood the potential implications of his diagnosis better than they were willing to acknowledge openly. The family dynamics during this waiting period were tense and artificial, with everyone carefully monitoring their words and actions to avoid creating additional evidence that might support Dr. Mitchell's interpretation of my injuries. Conversations about Tyler's collision with me became increasingly sanitized and scripted, with each family member contributing to a coordinated narrative that emphasized the accidental nature of the incident and Tyler's immediate concern for my welfare. The collaborative nature of this narrative construction was itself revealing, demonstrating the family's capacity for organizing around a shared version of events that protected Tyler from consequences while minimizing the significance of my injuries. My growing awareness of these family dynamics was both enlightening and isolating, creating psychological distance from people I'd trusted throughout my life while forcing me to question my own perceptions and memories of experiences that had shaped my understanding of normal relationships and acceptable behavior. The medical evidence was providing validation for pain and dysfunction that I'd been told to ignore or overcome, but it was also revealing patterns of manipulation and denial that extended far beyond Tyler's physical aggression to include systematic dismissal of my experiences and feelings by the adults who were supposed to protect and support me. The night before my follow-up appointment with Dr. Mitchell, I lay awake reviewing the documentation I'd prepared and trying to anticipate the questions he would ask about my family's response to his diagnosis and my plans for ensuring my future safety. The conversation would require me to acknowledge things about my family and my childhood that I'd never spoken aloud, and I wasn't sure whether I had the courage to be completely honest about experiences that still felt disloyal to discuss with someone outside our family circle. Rebecca's final advice before the appointment was simple but profound: tell the truth about what happened and let Dr. Mitchell help me understand the medical implications of that truth, rather than trying to protect my family from consequences they'd created through their own choices and behavior. Her reminder that I deserved medical care that addressed the real causes of my injuries rather than convenient explanations that protected other people's reputations was exactly what I needed to hear, but it was also terrifying because it meant accepting responsibility for disrupting family relationships that had been central to my identity for my entire life. The morning of the appointment arrived gray and humid, matching my emotional state as I prepared for a conversation that would likely determine not just my medical treatment but also my relationship with my family and my understanding of my own experiences. Mom and Dad's decision to accompany me felt increasingly intrusive and controlling as we drove toward Columbus, their careful monitoring of my mood and their strategic reminders about family loyalty creating additional pressure to minimize my concerns and support their interpretation of Tyler's behavior rather than pursuing medical care that addressed the full scope of my injuries. Dr. Mitchell's greeting was warm and professional, but his immediate suggestion that we begin with a private consultation before including my parents in our discussion created the first opportunity for honest conversation about my experiences without the family dynamics that had been shaping and limiting my ability to acknowledge the full extent of Tyler's abuse. The relief I felt at being able to speak freely about my documentation and my concerns was overwhelming, representing the first time in my life that an adult had prioritized my welfare over family harmony and reputation management. His review of my incident documentation was thorough and systematic, with careful questions about each event that helped me understand the medical significance of injuries I'd dismissed as minor childhood accidents. Dr. Mitchell's experience with trauma patients allowed him to recognize patterns of abuse that victims often don't identify themselves, and his validation of my experiences provided the foundation for developing a treatment plan that addressed both my physical injuries and the psychological impact of systematic family denial and minimization of my pain. The conversation that followed was unlike any medical consultation I'd ever experienced, combining clinical expertise with genuine concern for my safety and well-being in ways that helped me understand that my injuries were neither my fault nor something I deserved, regardless of my family's suggestions about my oversensitivity or tendency toward drama. Dr. Mitchell's explanation of how chronic trauma affects both physical healing and psychological development provided a framework for understanding my experiences that was completely different from the character-building narrative my family had used to justify Tyler's behavior and my parents' dismissive responses to my complaints. His recommendation for comprehensive treatment that included not just medical intervention for my current injuries but also psychological support for processing the trauma I'd experienced was presented as standard care for patients dealing with systematic abuse rather than something exceptional or dramatic that would disrupt normal family relationships. The matter-of-fact way he discussed the need for protective measures and safety planning helped normalize my situation and reduce the guilt I felt about acknowledging that my brother's behavior represented ongoing danger rather than unfortunate accidents that could be prevented through better communication and understanding. Dr. Mitchell's decision to include my parents in the consultation after our private discussion was strategic and deliberate, designed to present his findings and recommendations in a way that would make it difficult for them to continue dismissing the medical evidence or maintaining their alternative explanations for my injuries. His approach was professional but firm, establishing from the beginning that this conversation would focus on medical facts and treatment requirements rather than family preferences or reputation concerns that had been driving their previous responses to his diagnosis. The tension in the consultation room was immediately apparent as Mom and Dad settled into their chairs with the defensive posture of people who understood they were about to be challenged on fundamental assumptions about their family dynamics and parenting decisions. Their careful positioning and coordinated body language suggested they'd prepared for this meeting as a unified front against medical conclusions they considered threatening to their family's stability and Tyler's future prospects. Dr. Mitchell began by reviewing the technical aspects of my MRI findings in detail that was both educational and undeniable, pointing to specific areas of damage and explaining the biomechanical forces that would be required to create such extensive trauma to my spinal structures. His explanation was methodical and scientific, removing any possibility that his conclusions were based on speculation or misinterpretation rather than objective medical evidence that could be verified by any qualified radiologist or orthopedic specialist. The pattern of injuries he described included not just the recent herniation that had brought us to his office but also evidence of multiple previous episodes of significant trauma that had occurred over several years and had healed improperly due to lack of appropriate medical intervention. The scarring and bone changes visible on my imaging studies told a story of repeated injury and inadequate treatment that was inconsistent with isolated accidents or normal childhood mishaps. Dad's first response was to challenge Dr. Mitchell's interpretation by questioning whether the imaging findings could be explained through Emma's participation in track and field, suggesting that distance running and jumping events could subject the spine to repetitive stress that might mimic the pattern of trauma Dr. Mitchell was describing. His coaching experience had taught him that athletic activities could cause cumulative damage over time, and he was confident that a medical professional unfamiliar with competitive athletics might misinterpret normal wear patterns as evidence of abuse or violence. Dr. Mitchell's reply was patient but definitive, explaining that his practice specialized in athletic injuries and that he was thoroughly familiar with the biomechanical stresses associated with all forms of competitive sports, including track and field events. The damage pattern visible on my MRI was not consistent with repetitive athletic stress but rather indicated acute trauma episodes involving significant compressive and rotational forces that were typically associated with motor vehicle accidents, falls from height, or direct physical assault. Mom's approach was more focused on questioning the timeline and causation, suggesting that Dr. Mitchell's conclusions about chronic abuse were based on circumstantial evidence rather than definitive proof that Tyler had been responsible for my previous injuries. Her administrative training had taught her to distinguish between correlation and causation, and she argued that the presence of old injuries didn't necessarily implicate Tyler in their creation even if he'd been involved in the most recent incident. The conversation that followed was a careful dance between medical professionalism and family denial, with Dr. Mitchell maintaining his clinical perspective while my parents deployed increasingly sophisticated arguments designed to protect Tyler from accountability and preserve their family's reputation within the Millbrook community. Their coordinated defense demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking and mutual support that had probably enabled Tyler's behavior to continue for years without serious consequences or intervention. Dr. Mitchell's patience with their arguments was impressive but finite, and his eventual response cut through their deflections with surgical precision. The medical evidence was clear and unambiguous about the nature and extent of my injuries, and his professional obligation was to ensure that I received appropriate treatment while also addressing the underlying causes that had created the pattern of trauma visible on my imaging studies. His recommendation for involving protective services and law enforcement was presented as standard protocol for cases involving systematic physical abuse, rather than a dramatic escalation based on family-specific concerns. The mention of legal involvement transformed the consultation room atmosphere from tense disagreement to crisis management, as my parents realized that Dr. Mitchell's diagnosis carried implications that extended far beyond medical treatment to include potential criminal charges and public scrutiny that could destroy both Tyler's athletic future and our family's standing in the community. Their immediate focus shifted from challenging his medical conclusions to negotiating the scope and timing of any official reporting that might result from his findings. Dad's response revealed the depth of his concern about Tyler's college prospects and the family's reputation as he began outlining the potential consequences of abuse allegations for a high school athlete who was already being evaluated by college recruiters and scholarship committees. His argument was that involving law enforcement would effectively end Tyler's chances of receiving athletic scholarships, regardless of whether any criminal charges were ultimately filed, since the mere existence of an investigation would raise questions about his character that coaches and administrators would be unwilling to overlook. Mom's focus was on the broader implications for the family's professional standing, recognizing that abuse allegations against Tyler would inevitably reflect on her position as an elementary school principal and Dad's role as a high school coach. Their careers depended on community trust and confidence in their ability to work with children and teenagers, and any suggestion that they'd failed to protect their own daughter from systematic abuse would raise serious questions about their professional competence and judgment. Dr. Mitchell's response to their concerns was compassionate but unwavering, explaining that his primary obligation was to his patients' welfare rather than protecting the family from consequences of their failure to address Tyler's abusive behavior. The medical evidence documented serious ongoing trauma that posed continued risks to my physical safety and psychological well-being, and his professional ethics required him to ensure that appropriate protective measures were implemented regardless of the impact on other family members' goals or reputations. The revelation that Dr. Mitchell had already contacted Child Protective Services and filed a mandatory report based on his medical findings created an immediate shift in family dynamics as everyone realized that the situation had moved beyond their control and into official channels that would require legal rather than medical responses. The report had been filed according to Ohio's mandatory reporting requirements for medical professionals who identified evidence of abuse, and the investigation process would begin regardless of our family's preferences or cooperation. My parents' reaction to this news was a mixture of panic and strategic planning, as they tried to understand the timeline and procedures that would govern the investigation, while simultaneously developing a defensive strategy that would minimize the impact on Tyler's future and their professional reputations. Their immediate questions focused on confidentiality protections, disclosure requirements, and the possibility of resolving the situation through family counseling or voluntary intervention programs that would avoid criminal charges and public records. Tyler's arrival at the medical office was unexpected and dramatic, suggesting that he'd been monitoring our location and timing rather than waiting at home for updates about the consultation. His appearance in the consultation room was clearly calculated to demonstrate his concern for my welfare and his willingness to cooperate with medical recommendations, but his presence also created an opportunity for Dr. Mitchell to observe family dynamics firsthand and assess the credibility of various explanations for my injury patterns. The interaction between Tyler and my parents was revealing in ways that supported Dr. Mitchell's conclusions about systematic family dysfunction and enabling behavior. Their coordinated responses to his questions, their careful monitoring of each other's statements, and their obvious anxiety about saying anything that might contradict their established narrative demonstrated the kind of collaborative deception that typically develops in families where abuse has been occurring over extended periods.
Tyler's performance during the consultation was sophisticated and well-rehearsed, involving expressions of remorse for his role in my current injury combined with detailed explanations of his immediate response and ongoing concern for my recovery. His ability to present himself as a caring brother who'd been devastated by accidentally hurting me was compelling and might have been convincing to someone without Dr. Mitchell's experience in recognizing manipulative behavior and family systems that protect abusers from accountability. However, Tyler's knowledge of my medical history and his detailed familiarity with injury mechanisms revealed information that contradicted his claims about the isolated and accidental nature of our basement collision. His explanations for previous incidents that could account for the chronic trauma patterns visible on my MRI demonstrated awareness of events and circumstances that suggested much more extensive involvement in my injuries than he was willing to acknowledge directly. Dr. Mitchell's questioning of Tyler was careful and professional, designed to elicit information rather than create confrontation, but the pattern of responses revealed inconsistencies and gaps that supported his conclusions about systematic abuse rather than isolated accidents. Tyler's defensive reactions to specific questions about timing and circumstances suggested that he understood exactly what Dr. Mitchell was investigating and was prepared with explanations that had probably been developed and refined over years of avoiding accountability for his aggressive behavior. The consultation concluded with Dr. Mitchell's clear recommendation for comprehensive treatment that would address both my immediate medical needs and the underlying trauma that had created my injury pattern. His treatment plan included immediate intervention for the current herniation, physical therapy designed to address chronic dysfunction from previous injuries, and psychological support to help me process the impact of systematic abuse and develop strategies for protecting myself from future incidents. His final words to my parents were direct and unambiguous about their responsibility to ensure my safety and support my recovery, rather than prioritizing Tyler's reputation or their family's public image. The investigation that had been initiated by his mandatory report would proceed according to legal requirements, and their cooperation with that process would be evaluated as part of determining appropriate consequences and intervention strategies. The drive home from Columbus was conducted in complete silence as each family member processed the implications of Dr. Mitchell's diagnosis and the official investigation that was now inevitable. The comfortable fiction that Tyler's behavior represented normal sibling rivalry had been definitively destroyed by medical evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away, and everyone understood that our family's dynamics were about to be subjected to external scrutiny that would require fundamental changes in how we related to each other. Mom's phone began ringing before we reached Millbrook, with calls from Child Protective Services requesting interviews and documentation that would begin the formal investigation process. The efficiency of the system response demonstrated that Dr. Mitchell's report had been taken seriously and that trained professionals would be evaluating our family's situation according to established protocols for protecting victims of domestic abuse, rather than allowing us to manage the situation internally through family meetings and negotiated agreements. Dad's immediate response was to contact a family attorney who specialized in defending against abuse allegations, recognizing that Tyler's future and their professional reputations would depend on legal strategies rather than medical arguments or family dynamics. His choice of attorney revealed prior knowledge of legal resources for these specific circumstances, suggesting that concerns about Tyler's behavior and potential consequences had been considered previously, even if they'd never been acknowledged openly within our family discussions. Tyler's behavior during the following days was markedly different from his previous responses to my complaints about his aggressive behavior, characterized by exaggerated concern for my welfare and obvious anxiety about the investigation process that was beginning to examine his role in my injuries. His attempts to demonstrate appropriate sibling relationships felt performative and calculated, designed to create evidence of caring behavior that would contradict the pattern of abuse that Dr. Mitchell had documented.
The first interview with the Child Protective Services investigator was scheduled for the following week, providing time for our family to prepare responses and coordinate our narrative, while also allowing me to process the reality that my experiences were finally being taken seriously by adults with the authority and responsibility to protect me from further harm. The validation was simultaneously liberating and terrifying, since it meant acknowledging things about my family and my childhood that I'd never been allowed to discuss openly. Rebecca's support during this period was invaluable, providing both practical assistance with preparing for the investigation and emotional support for processing the psychological impact of having my experiences validated by medical professionals and protective services. Her pre-med training helped her understand the medical aspects of my case, while her friendship provided the safe space I needed to explore feelings and memories that my family had taught me to suppress or minimize. The documentation process that Rebecca had helped me begin became central to the investigation, as Child Protective Services requested detailed information about previous incidents and family responses that would help them understand the pattern of abuse and enabling behavior that had allowed Tyler's aggression to continue for years. The systematic review of my experiences was difficult but necessary for developing a complete picture of how our family's dynamics had created and maintained an environment where abuse could occur without consequences. The community's response to news about the investigation was swift and divisive, reflecting the complex loyalties and relationships that characterized small-town life, where family reputations were intertwined with professional standing and social connections. Dad's position as football coach and Mom's role as elementary school principal meant that speculation about Tyler's behavior inevitably raised questions about their professional competence and judgment that extended far beyond our family's private business. Tyler's teammates and their families were particularly affected by the investigation, since their own children had been spending time in our home and participating in training activities that might have exposed them to similar risks. The realization that parents had unknowingly allowed their teenagers to be around someone who was apparently capable of systematic violence against family members created anxiety and anger that further complicated our family's position within the community. The school district's response to the investigation was immediate and bureaucratic, involving administrative leave for both of my parents while the allegations were being evaluated and potential policies violations were assessed. Their absence from their professional roles created additional pressure for quick resolution, while also signaling to the community that the situation was being taken seriously by institutional authorities rather than being dismissed as family drama or teenage misbehavior. Tyler's suspension from the football team was announced through official channels that emphasized the school's commitment to student safety while also protecting his legal rights during the investigation process. The carefully worded statements avoided specific details about the allegations but made clear that his participation in athletic activities would be suspended until the investigation was completed and appropriate decisions could be made about his continued eligibility. The impact on Tyler's college recruitment was immediate and devastating, as coaches and scholarship committees responded to news about the investigation by withdrawing offers and canceling planned visits rather than risking association with a potential abuse case. The competitive nature of college athletics meant that any suggestion of character issues or legal problems was sufficient to eliminate prospects regardless of athletic ability or previous achievements. My own response to these developments was complex and conflicted, involving relief that my experiences were finally being acknowledged and addressed, while also feeling guilty about the consequences that my honesty was creating for other family members. The psychological impact of systematic abuse included self-blame and responsibility for family harmony that made it difficult to maintain focus on my own welfare rather than trying to minimize the damage to people who had participated in creating and maintaining the abusive environment. Dr. Mitchell's ongoing medical treatment provided stability and perspective during this chaotic period, as his continued validation of my experiences and professional support for my recovery helped counter the guilt and manipulation that characterized my family's response to the investigation. His recommendation for individual therapy was particularly valuable for helping me understand that Tyler's behavior and its consequences were not my responsibility, regardless of my family's attempts to blame me for destroying their carefully constructed image. The therapeutic process revealed the extent to which my identity and self-perception had been shaped by years of minimizing my own experiences and prioritizing other people's comfort over my own welfare. Learning to recognize my own feelings and needs as legitimate and important was a fundamental challenge that required unlearning patterns of self-denial and people-pleasing that had been reinforced throughout my childhood and adolescence. The investigation's preliminary findings confirmed Dr. Mitchell's medical conclusions while also revealing additional evidence of Tyler's aggressive behavior that extended beyond our family to include incidents at school and in community settings that had been dismissed or covered up through his athletic status and our parents' professional influence. The pattern that emerged was of systematic violence that had been enabled and protected through institutional loyalties and community investment in Tyler's athletic success. The Child Protective Services investigation concluded 6 weeks later with findings that validated everything Dr. Mitchell had documented and revealed additional evidence that even I hadn't fully understood about the systematic nature of Tyler's abuse and our family's enabling behavior. Detective Lisa Rodriguez, who had been assigned to handle the criminal aspects of the case, presented a comprehensive report that included interviews with teachers, coaches, teammates, and neighbors who had witnessed incidents over the years but had dismissed them as normal athletic aggression or sibling rivalry. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond our family's basement, including documented incidents at school where Tyler had injured other students during what were characterized as accidents or overly enthusiastic play. The school's records revealed multiple reports from teachers and staff about Tyler's aggressive behavior, but these concerns had been consistently minimized or dismissed due to his athletic achievements and our parents' professional influence within the district. Most damaging to Tyler's defense was testimony from his former teammates who once granted immunity and confidentiality protections described witnessing systematic bullying and physical intimidation that Tyler had directed not just toward me but toward younger or smaller players who couldn't defend themselves effectively. The culture of silence that had protected Tyler was broken when investigators made it clear that failure to cooperate could result in charges for those who had participated in covering up criminal behavior. The medical evidence that Dr. Mitchell had provided proved to be the cornerstone that allowed investigators to build a comprehensive case demonstrating not just the recent herniation incident but years of physical abuse that had been carefully hidden through family manipulation and community loyalty to successful athletic programs. The objective nature of imaging studies and medical documentation provided irrefutable proof that contradicted every alternative explanation my family had attempted to construct. Tyler's arrest occurred on a Tuesday morning during what would have been his first week of senior year football practice, creating maximum impact within the community and ensuring that news of the charges would spread throughout the school district and athletic networks that had previously celebrated his achievements. The timing was strategic, designed to prevent any attempts to minimize the charges or negotiate private resolutions that might have protected Tyler from serious consequences. The charges filed against Tyler included multiple counts of domestic violence, assault and reckless endangerment spanning a 3-year period, with prosecutors indicating that additional charges might be filed as the investigation continued and more evidence was developed. The severity of the charges reflected not just the recent herniation incident but the documented pattern of escalating violence that investigators had uncovered through their comprehensive review of my medical history and witness testimonies. My parents' arrest followed 2 days later on charges of child endangerment, failure to report suspected abuse, and conspiracy to obstruct justice for their role in covering up Tyler's behavior and preventing me from receiving appropriate medical care for my injuries. The charges against them were particularly significant because their professional roles as educators had created additional legal obligations to protect children that they had violated through their enabling of Tyler's abuse. The community's response to these arrests was immediate and polarizing, dividing along lines that reflected different priorities about loyalty, justice, and the protection of children versus the preservation of athletic programs and family reputations. The Sullivan family's fall from prominent community standing to criminal defendants created a vacuum that forced residents to confront uncomfortable questions about how institutional loyalties and athletic success could create environments where abuse was enabled and protected. Coach Williams, my former track coach, who had maintained a relationship with me throughout college, emerged as one of the most important witnesses in demonstrating how my athletic performance and physical condition had been affected by chronic injuries that should have raised concerns among adults who were trained to monitor student-athlete welfare. His testimony about my persistent complaints of back pain and reduced performance capacity provided additional evidence that contradicted my family's claims about my tendency toward exaggeration or attention-seeking behavior. The legal proceedings extended over 8 months, during which time I continued my physical therapy and psychological treatment while living with Rebecca's family in Columbus to ensure my safety and provide distance from the community pressure and media attention that surrounded the case. The separation from Millbrook was both necessary and healing, allowing me to focus on my recovery without the constant stress of encountering people who were invested in protecting Tyler's reputation or questioning my credibility. Dr. Mitchell's continued involvement in my treatment provided stability and professional support throughout the legal process, as his expertise in trauma-related injuries helped guide my physical rehabilitation, while his willingness to testify reinforced the medical evidence that formed the foundation of the prosecution's case. His treatment approach addressed not just the immediate spinal injuries, but also the chronic dysfunction that had resulted from years of inadequate medical care and family pressure to minimize my symptoms. The psychological therapy that Dr. Mitchell had recommended proved to be equally important for helping me understand and process the complex emotions involved in finally acknowledging the systematic abuse I had experienced, while also dealing with guilt about the consequences that my honesty had created for my family. Learning to prioritize my own welfare and safety over family loyalty and community harmony required fundamental changes in thinking patterns that had been shaped by years of manipulation and gaslighting. Tyler's eventual plea agreement resulted in a sentence of 3 years in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation, along with mandatory anger management and psychological treatment that would be required for any future contact with family members or participation in athletic activities. The sentence reflected the seriousness of his crimes, while also acknowledging his age and potential for rehabilitation if he was willing to accept responsibility for his behavior and engage in meaningful treatment. My parents' plea agreements resulted in suspended sentences and community service, but their professional licenses were permanently revoked, effectively ending their careers in education and requiring them to rebuild their lives in different communities where their reputations hadn't been destroyed by their failure to protect their own daughter from systematic abuse. The loss of their professional identities and community standing represented consequences that were proportionate to their enabling of Tyler's behavior and their prioritization of family reputation over child safety. The civil lawsuit that Rebecca helped me file against the school district for failing to address Tyler's pattern of aggressive behavior, despite multiple reports and warning signs, resulted in a settlement that provided financial resources for my continued medical treatment and educational expenses, while also creating policy changes designed to prevent similar failures in protecting students from peer violence. The settlement negotiations revealed institutional knowledge of Tyler's behavior that had been systematically ignored or minimized due to his athletic value and our family's professional influence. The most significant long-term outcome of the legal proceedings was the implementation of mandatory reporting protocols and training programs throughout the district that were designed to ensure that future incidents of student violence would be properly investigated and addressed, rather than being dismissed as athletic aggression or normal teenage behavior. These changes represented acknowledgement that institutional failures had contributed to the environment that allowed Tyler's abuse to continue and escalate over time. My recovery process was gradual and multifaceted, involving not just physical rehabilitation from the spinal injuries, but also psychological healing from years of systematic gaslighting and emotional manipulation that had taught me to distrust my own perceptions and prioritize other people's comfort over my own safety. The validation provided by medical evidence and legal proceedings was crucial for rebuilding my confidence in my ability to accurately assess situations and make decisions that protected my welfare. The completion of my physical therapy program took nearly a year and required modifications to my career plans, as the chronic effects of my spinal injuries made some aspects of hands-on patient care more challenging than I had originally anticipated. However, the experience of being failed by medical professionals who dismissed my complaints and enabled my family's denial had also deepened my understanding of how healthcare systems could better serve trauma survivors and protect vulnerable patients from continued abuse. My decision to specialize in trauma-informed physical therapy was directly influenced by my own experience of receiving treatment that addressed both the physical and psychological aspects of systematic abuse, and my goal became helping other survivors navigate medical systems that were often unprepared to recognize or respond appropriately to the complex needs of patients whose injuries resulted from interpersonal violence rather than accidents or sports-related incidents. The scholarship fund that was established through the civil settlement created opportunities for other survivors of family violence to pursue education and career training that would provide financial independence and professional skills necessary for building safe and stable lives away from abusive environments. The fund's focus on supporting survivors who wanted to work in healthcare, education, or social services reflected my belief that people who had experienced systematic trauma often possessed unique insights and motivation for protecting others from similar experiences. Rebecca's continued friendship and professional partnership proved invaluable as we both completed our education and began working in healthcare settings that diverse populations, including many trauma survivors who needed advocates and allies who understood the complexity of recovery from systematic abuse. Our shared experience of navigating medical systems and legal proceedings provided a foundation for developing programs that better serve patients whose needs extended beyond traditional medical models. The establishment of a trauma advocacy program at Millbrook General Hospital represented full-circle validation of Dr. Mitchell's original vision for comprehensive care that addressed not just physical injuries but also the systematic factors that created and maintained environments where abuse could occur. The program provided training for medical staff in recognizing signs of systematic abuse, while also creating protocols for ensuring patient safety and appropriate referrals to protective services and legal resources. My eventual return to Millbrook 5 years after Tyler's conviction was motivated by a desire to contribute to community healing and institutional change rather than seeking reconciliation with family members who had never fully acknowledged their role in enabling years of abuse and preventing me from receiving appropriate protection and medical care. The community had been fundamentally changed by the legal proceedings and policy implementations that resulted from our case, and my presence represented continuity with efforts to prevent similar failures in the future. Tyler's release from prison after serving 2 years of his sentence was accompanied by strict probation requirements that included mandatory psychological treatment, community service focused on violence prevention education, and supervised contact with family members that would be monitored by probation officers trained in domestic violence cases. His participation in these programs was voluntary but represented his only opportunity for rebuilding relationships with family members and community connections that had been destroyed by his criminal behavior. Our first supervised meeting occurred in a therapeutic setting with professional facilitators who specialized in restorative justice processes for family violence cases, providing structure and safety for conversations that addressed accountability, impact,
and the possibility of limited future contact that prioritized my safety and emotional well-being over family reunification or Tyler's desire for forgiveness and acceptance. Tyler's acknowledgement of the systematic nature of his abuse and its impact on my physical and psychological well-being represented genuine progress in his treatment, but my response was cautious and conditional, focused on establishing clear boundaries and expectations for any future contact rather than attempting to rebuild the sibling relationship that had been fundamentally damaged by years of violence and family denial. The conversation revealed Tyler's understanding that his behavior had been criminal and harmful rather than normal sibling rivalry, and his acceptance of responsibility for creating an environment where I had been unable to seek appropriate medical care or family protection without facing additional abuse and manipulation. His willingness to support my ongoing advocacy work and policy development efforts demonstrated recognition that meaningful amends involved more than personal apology and required contribution to systematic changes that would protect other potential victims. My parents' response to the restorative justice process was more complex and defensive, involving partial acknowledgement of their enabling behavior combined with continued attempts to minimize their responsibility and blame external pressures and circumstances for their failure to protect me from systematic abuse. Their inability to fully accept accountability for their choices limited the possibility of meaningful reconciliation, but their participation in the process provided closure and clarity about the nature of our ongoing relationship. The professional work I eventually developed focused on training healthcare providers, educators, and community leaders in recognizing and responding appropriately to systematic abuse, particularly in cases where family dynamics and institutional loyalties created barriers to protecting victims and holding perpetrators accountable. The training programs drew directly from my experience of navigating systems that were unprepared to address complex trauma and family manipulation. The publication of our case study in medical and social work journals provided documentation that helped other professionals understand how medical evidence could be used to validate survivor experiences and support legal proceedings against perpetrators and enabling family members. The academic recognition of our case contributed to policy development and training programs that were implemented in healthcare systems and educational institutions throughout Ohio and other states. The most meaningful outcome of my advocacy work was hearing from other survivors who had used documentation and resources that were developed through our case to seek appropriate medical care, legal protection, and family intervention that prevented continued abuse and enabled them to build safe and independent lives. Their success stories represented the ultimate validation of the difficult decision to pursue legal accountability rather than accepting family pressure to minimize Tyler's behavior and protect our community reputation. The 25-year-old version of myself who stands in Dr. Mitchell's office today reviewing imaging studies that show successful spinal fusion and complete recovery from the herniation that Tyler caused understands that the gentle push in our basement was neither gentle nor isolated, but rather the final incident in a pattern of systematic violence that required medical intervention, legal accountability, and community change to address appropriately. The scar tissue visible on my current imaging studies represents not just physical healing from chronic trauma but also psychological recovery from years of gaslighting and manipulation that had taught me to distrust my own perceptions and prioritize other people's comfort over my own safety and well-being. The medical evidence that Dr. Mitchell provided 7 years ago created the foundation for rebuilding my life according to my own values and goals rather than family expectations and community pressures. The advocacy organization that I now direct serves survivors throughout Central Ohio by providing medical advocacy, legal support, and educational resources that help people navigate complex systems while also working to change policies and practices that enable abuse to continue. The work represents not just personal healing but contribution to systematic changes that protect other vulnerable individuals from experiencing the isolation and denial that characterized my own childhood and adolescence. Tyler's continued participation in violence prevention education and his support for policy changes that strengthen reporting requirements and victim protection represents genuine accountability for his criminal behavior,
but our relationship remains limited and conditional based on my assessment of safety and emotional well-being rather than family expectations or community pressure for reconciliation and forgiveness. The Sullivan family legacy in Millbrook is now defined not by athletic achievements or professional success but by the systematic changes that resulted from our case and the ongoing efforts to ensure that future incidents of family violence are addressed through appropriate medical, legal, and social service interventions rather than being dismissed as normal conflict or character-building experiences. My story continues to serve as documentation that medical evidence can provide validation and protection for survivors who have been systematically gaslighted and manipulated, and that holding perpetrators and enabling family members accountable through legal proceedings creates possibilities for healing and prevention that extend far beyond individual cases to include community-wide changes in how institutions respond to violence and protect vulnerable individuals. The gentle push that herniated my disc revealed not just chronic physical trauma but systematic family dysfunction that required comprehensive intervention to address, and the MRI that showed the truth created possibilities for justice, healing, and prevention that continue to influence my work and my understanding of how medical advocacy can serve trauma survivors and create systematic change. 10 years after that devastating MRI revealed the truth about my brother's systematic abuse, I stand in the lecture hall at Ohio State University's medical school, addressing a packed auditorium of future doctors, nurses, and physical therapists about the critical importance of recognizing patterns of family violence that hide behind sporting culture and community loyalty. The PowerPoint slide behind me displays the same spinal imaging that Dr. Mitchell used to validate my experiences a decade ago, but now these images serve as educational tools for training the next generation of healthcare providers to see beyond surface explanations and ask the difficult questions that can save lives. The medical students in the front row take careful notes as I explain how chronic trauma presents differently from acute injuries, how family dynamics can prevent accurate reporting of symptoms, and why healthcare providers must be prepared to serve as advocates for patients whose safety depends on professional courage to challenge respected community members and institutional hierarchies. Their attentiveness reflects a generational shift in medical education that prioritizes patient welfare over professional convenience and recognizes systematic abuse as a public health crisis requiring clinical intervention rather than private family resolution. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, now the Director of Emergency Medicine at Ohio State's Teaching Hospital, introduced me as a leading expert in trauma-informed healthcare delivery and survivor advocacy, but her personal knowledge of my case adds weight to the presentation that academic credentials alone couldn't provide. Her decision to leave Millbrook General and pursue leadership opportunities in academic medicine was influenced by our case and her recognition that rural healthcare systems needed better training and resources for identifying and responding to systematic family violence. The comprehensive curriculum changes that resulted from our collaboration include mandatory training modules on recognizing signs of systematic abuse, understanding the medical presentation of chronic trauma, and implementing safety protocols that protect patients from retaliation while ensuring appropriate reporting to protective services and law enforcement. These educational requirements represent fundamental shifts in how medical professionals are prepared to serve vulnerable populations who depend on healthcare systems for protection as well as treatment. Marcus Thompson, who attended today's presentation as a second-year medical student, represents one of the most meaningful outcomes of the systematic changes that emerged from my family's case. His decision to pursue emergency medicine was directly influenced by witnessing how Dr. Mitchell's intervention had saved my life and created possibilities for justice that extended far beyond individual medical treatment. His presence in medical school demonstrates how trauma survivors can transform their experiences into professional expertise that serves other vulnerable individuals. The national recognition that our case received through medical journals and policy conferences led to implementation of similar training programs in healthcare systems throughout the Midwest, creating regional networks of providers who understood the complexity of family violence and possessed the clinical skills necessary for serving trauma survivors effectively. The ripple effects continue expanding as graduates from these programs establish practices and protocols that prioritize patient safety over institutional loyalty and community harmony. Rebecca Chen, now Dr. Rebecca Chen and director of the Trauma Psychology program at Cleveland Clinic, maintains our professional partnership through research initiatives that document the long-term health outcomes for survivors who receive comprehensive medical advocacy during legal proceedings against family perpetrators. Our longitudinal study follows over 200 cases where medical evidence was used to support criminal prosecution and family intervention, providing data that demonstrates improved physical and psychological recovery when healthcare systems actively support survivor safety rather than maintaining neutrality. The research findings consistently show that survivors who receive trauma-informed medical care during legal proceedings experience better long-term outcomes across multiple measures including chronic pain management, psychological stability, educational achievement, and career development compared to those who navigate the legal system without comprehensive healthcare advocacy. These results provide empirical support for policy recommendations that require medical institutions to provide victim advocacy services rather than limiting their involvement to clinical treatment and mandatory reporting. Tyler's participation in our research as a former perpetrator who completed court-mandated treatment programs provides unique insights into the factors that support genuine accountability and behavior change versus superficial compliance designed to satisfy legal requirements without addressing underlying attitudes and beliefs that enable violence. His interviews reveal the importance of consequences that extend beyond individual punishment to include systematic changes in family dynamics and community responses that previously enabled and protected abusive behavior. His current work as a violence prevention educator in juvenile detention facilities represents genuine rehabilitation that addresses the root causes of his criminal behavior rather than simply managing its external manifestations. The program he helps facilitate focuses on teaching young offenders to recognize and challenge the cultural messages about masculinity, competition, and family loyalty that had justified and normalized his systematic abuse of family members and peers throughout his adolescence. The conversation we had last month during the annual review of his probation requirements demonstrated continued progress in understanding the impact of his choices on my life and development, but also revealed ongoing challenges in fully grasping the systematic nature of the family dysfunction that had enabled his behavior to continue and escalate over years. His growth represents hope for other perpetrators who are willing to engage in meaningful accountability processes, but also illustrates the complexity of addressing deeply ingrained patterns of thinking and behavior that develop during formative years. My parents' response to the systematic changes that resulted from our case has been more limited and defensive, characterized by partial acknowledgement of their enabling behavior combined with continued attempts to minimize their responsibility for creating an environment where systematic abuse could occur without intervention. Their participation in family counseling and restorative justice processes has been motivated primarily by legal requirements rather than genuine commitment to understanding how their choices affected my safety and well-being throughout my childhood and adolescence. Mom's new career as a victim rights advocate in a different state represents an attempt to contribute positively to systematic change while also maintaining distance from the community where her professional reputation was destroyed by her failure to protect her own daughter from documented abuse. Her work with other families navigating the legal system provides valuable services to trauma survivors, but her motivation appears focused on personal redemption rather than institutional change or policy development that would address the systematic factors that enabled my abuse. Dad's involvement in coaching prevention programs that address violence in youth athletics reflects similar mixed motivations, combining genuine understanding of how competitive sports culture can normalize and hide systematic abuse with ongoing defensiveness about his specific choices and their consequences for our family. His current work provides valuable education to other coaches about recognizing warning signs and implementing protective policies, but his presentations consistently avoid acknowledging the institutional failures and personal choices that allowed Tyler's behavior to continue and escalate. The elementary school where Mom previously served as principal has implemented comprehensive policy changes that create mandatory reporting protocols, staff training requirements, and family intervention procedures designed to ensure that future incidents of student violence are addressed through appropriate protective measures rather than being dismissed as normal childhood conflict or character-building experiences. The changes represent acknowledgement that institutional failures contributed to the environment that protected Tyler from accountability while preventing me from receiving appropriate protection and support. Millbrook High School's response has been more complex and resistant, involving policy changes that satisfy legal requirements while maintaining cultural elements that continue to prioritize athletic achievement and institutional reputation over student safety and welfare. The coaching staff receives annual training about recognizing signs of systematic abuse, but the school's identity remains closely tied to athletic success in ways that create ongoing pressure to minimize problems that might affect team performance or community support for sports programs. The scholarship fund that was established through our civil settlement has now supported over 60 survivors of family violence in pursuing higher education and professional training that provides financial independence and career opportunities necessary for building safe and stable lives away from abusive environments. The recipients include future doctors, teachers, social workers, and attorneys whose professional goals reflect their understanding of how systematic change requires advocates within institutional systems rather than just individual recovery and personal success. The most recent scholarship recipient is Maria Santos, a young woman whose documentation of systematic abuse by her stepfather was validated through medical evidence and resulted in criminal prosecution that protected her younger siblings from continued violence. Her acceptance to nursing school represents the kind of intergenerational prevention that our advocacy work aims to achieve as survivors develop professional expertise that enables them to protect other vulnerable individuals while also building personal security and independence. The annual conference that our organization hosts brings together healthcare providers, legal professionals, educators, and policymakers to share best practices and develop coordinated responses to family violence that address both individual case management and systematic prevention. This year's keynote speaker is Dr. James Mitchell, whose willingness to prioritize patient welfare over family comfort and community pressure provided the foundation for everything that followed in our case and continues to influence his practice and teaching in ways that protect other trauma survivors. The training workshops that constitute the core of our conference programming focus on practical skills and policy implementation rather than theoretical discussions about family dynamics or individual pathology, recognizing that systematic change requires specific competencies and institutional protocols rather than general awareness or good intentions. The participants leave with concrete tools for recognizing chronic trauma, implementing safety protocols, documenting evidence appropriately, and coordinating with legal and social service systems in ways that prioritize survivor welfare throughout complex intervention processes. The legislative advocacy component of our work has contributed to policy changes at state and federal levels that strengthen mandatory reporting requirements, improve funding for victim advocacy programs, and create accountability measures for institutions that fail to protect vulnerable individuals from systematic abuse. The legal framework that now exists provides better protection for survivors while also creating consequences for perpetrators and enabling family members that reflect the serious nature of systematic violence and its long-term impact on victim welfare and community safety. The personal healing that has occurred alongside this professional advocacy work represents the kind of integrated recovery that becomes possible when trauma survivors receive validation, protection, and support for transforming their experiences into systematic change that prevents others from enduring similar violence. The chronic pain that once dominated my daily experience has been replaced by physical strength and emotional resilience that enable sustained engagement in demanding advocacy work without compromising my health or well-being. The relationship I've built with my husband David, whom I met during graduate school, demonstrates how trauma survivors can develop healthy partnerships based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than the power dynamics and emotional manipulation that characterized my family relationships throughout childhood and adolescence. His background as a family law attorney specializing in domestic violence cases provides professional understanding of the legal and psychological complexities involved in systematic abuse, while his personal commitment to supporting my advocacy work reflects recognition that systematic change requires sustained effort from allies as well as survivors. Our decision to remain childless reflects careful consideration of the intergenerational transmission of trauma and our shared commitment to investing our emotional and financial resources in prevention work rather than family formation. But it also represents freedom to make choices based on our values and goals rather than family expectations or community pressure about normal life trajectories. The fulfillment that comes from preventing other children from experiencing systematic abuse provides meaning and purpose that surpasses traditional measures of personal success or family achievement. The house we purchased in Columbus includes a home office where I write policy papers and prepare training materials, but it also serves as a safe space for survivors who need temporary housing while navigating legal proceedings or developing independent living arrangements away from abusive family environments. The guest room has hosted dozens of women and men whose experiences parallel mine and who benefit from staying with advocates who understand the complexity of recovery and the importance of both practical support and emotional validation during difficult transition periods. The garden that David and I maintain together provides physical therapy for my ongoing spinal health while also serving as a metaphor for the patient work of creating systematic change that requires sustained attention and care over extended periods rather than dramatic interventions that produce immediate results. The vegetables we grow are shared with neighbors and community organizations, reflecting our understanding that healing and prevention work best when they're embedded in networks of mutual support and reciprocal care rather than isolated individual effort. The medical appointments that punctuate my calendar serve as reminders of the ongoing impact of chronic trauma while also providing opportunities to model trauma-informed healthcare interactions for providers who are learning to serve survivors more effectively. My relationship with current healthcare providers reflects the kind of collaborative partnership that becomes possible when patients are treated as experts on their own experiences rather than passive recipients of professional expertise and authority. The speaking engagements that take me throughout the Midwest and beyond provide opportunities to share our story with audiences who need to understand how systematic abuse operates within families and communities while also demonstrating that recovery and advocacy are possible when survivors receive appropriate medical, legal, and social support. The presentations always include specific recommendations for policy changes and practice improvements rather than simply describing problems or sharing personal experiences without actionable solutions. The letters I receive from healthcare providers, educators, and policymakers who attended these presentations indicate that our story continues influencing systematic change in ways that extend far beyond individual cases to include institutional protocols and professional training that protect vulnerable populations. The documentation of these changes provides evidence that trauma survivors can transform their experiences into systematic prevention that addresses root causes rather than just managing symptoms or consequences. The reflection that occurs during quiet moments in my office or garden reveals deep satisfaction with the choices I made to pursue accountability and systematic change rather than accepting family pressure to minimize Tyler's behavior and protect our community reputation through silence and denial. The validation that came from medical evidence created possibilities for justice and prevention that continue expanding through professional networks and policy initiatives that address the cultural and institutional factors that enable systematic family violence. The understanding I've developed about trauma recovery and prevention serves hundreds of survivors each year through direct advocacy, professional training, and policy development, but it also provides personal meaning and purpose that honors the pain of my childhood while transforming it into protection for other vulnerable individuals. The work represents not just individual healing but contribution to systematic change that addresses the root causes of family violence rather than just its immediate consequences. The legacy that will outlast my individual effort includes trained healthcare providers who recognize chronic trauma, legal professionals who understand the complexity of family violence, educators who implement protective policies, and policymakers who support systematic prevention through appropriate funding and accountability measures. The ripple effects continue expanding through professional networks and institutional changes that create safer environments for children and families throughout our region and beyond. The gentle push that herniated my disc 10 years ago revealed systematic family dysfunction that required comprehensive intervention to address, but it also created opportunities for justice, healing, and prevention that continue influencing my work and my understanding of how individual experiences can serve systematic change when survivors receive appropriate support for transforming trauma into advocacy and institutional reform. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.